credit for that video. So, of course, it's to him, but also to the RSA and to Cognitive Media. And I think you can find that video for anyone who missed it. I think it's online on YouTube. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground. And it might be best, instead of having any recaps, just to jump straight into the first few questions. And what we're also going to be doing every now and again, Robert at the back. Robert, are you there? He's in the front. Okay, so every now and again, I'll turn to Robert and ask him for a question from people on Twitter as well. So if I can open the floor to anyone who wants to ask the first question. This gentleman here. If you could stand up, and the microphone's on its way, and maybe let us know if there's a particular person on the panel you would like to answer.
My name is Professor Alexander Borisov from Moscow. I'm just wondering whether we start with questions, or we are free to make some remarks.
Sorry,
or we are free to make some remarks.
If you'd like to make a 2-minute remark, yes.
So then I trust I'll be more successful today, provided the moderator, the present-day moderator, does not stop me in 5 seconds. Do you promise that?
You have more than 5 seconds.
Thank you. So, thank you, dear panelists, for this delightful black and white picture. Saints against sinners, freedom fighters, who are mostly panelists, and the rank and file, where some of us must be ultra-conservatives. Well, it's really hard to discuss things in the English language, not in our original language, when some people speak so fastly, like Mr. Scher, who is well known in Moscow's NATO submachine gun by his way to speak. But really, I don't think we improve things if we insist on this black and white picture, because the question is mostly in interpretations and
Shades of gray between black and white. Yesterday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Ireland alluded to a well-known novel. I will risk to remind you of a well-known Irish limerick. Limerick is some 200, I believe, kilometers from Dublin. Unfortunately, we won't be able to visit it. But it goes like this, if my student's memory doesn't fail me. There was a queen of Antigua who said to the king, "What a pig you are." Said the king to the queen, "Is it my manners you mean, or do you refer to my figure?" So it's a question of interpretations, you know, and today, in today's world, I will just tell you several things. Google executives like to boast of their company informal motto, "Don't be evil," and stand accused of being just that. One could apply this motto to internet as a whole, so that to avoid making it a new battlefield. Because internet has become a new dynamic ecosystem of contradictory trends and competing interests. The gist of the matter, as some observers perceive, is this: public interests versus political interests. At the age of market economy and continuing economic and financial crisis, cyberspace is rapidly being politicized and commercialized and militarized, by the way. In some of the government documents, national strategies, cyberspace and space is on a par. In that chapter,
which is about military actions. So, and this is really scary. By this definition, freedom of information and expression in new revolutionary media is seriously jeopardized. And should this process gather momentum, we can easily come to balkanizing the web. And that's really a great concern to us, because instead of a single space and common information space, we'll be having these pieces, this fragmentation. Just to give you an idea of what's going on, it has been reported by Guardian, London newspaper, that Iran is planning to introduce a sealed national internet this summer. So how about other countries? In other words, are we moving fastly to a new split along the lines of a new edition of the Cold War? Today in the information sphere. Because we're talking about freedom of information, but I assure that it is always information and not propaganda and manipulation. Today there's a lot of politically oriented propaganda. And by the way, by this definition, we do not take seriously the criticism from Freedom House, because we do not think it has something to do with civil society. It's a government-funded organization. Take it or leave it. In that sense, what is very much on our mind, how to avoid getting back to the era of propaganda, to the era of launching air balloons, as it was in the 50s, with propaganda literature along the lines, across the lines. And we're very much concerned about that. And just to give you an idea what is going on today in the area of diplomacy and politics, I would refer to an example. Hopefully you will understand me correctly. I was a young intern many, many years ago in the embassy of Washington, in Washington, Soviet embassy at that time. And as an intern, we have the only privilege to be on duty on Saturdays and Sundays, when mature diplomats were enjoying life. And all of a sudden, I recall on Saturday, there was a knock at the door of the embassy, and a very familiar face was at the doorstep, who asked me for an appointment with the ambassador. He said that he had made that appointment before. Do you know who was that? That was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States, Gus Holt, who met with the ambassador and probably got some instructions at that time. Today we have an American ambassador in Moscow who is very active in social media, in social networks, who meets very often, even before accreditation. He met for the first time with Russian protest movement leaders, with the opposition leaders. And I personally, as opposed to some of my colleagues in Moscow, take it for granted as a revenge of history. So, but in a big way, if to put things in a big way, are we going to return to the digital era of Bolshevism or not? So, let's do our utmost to avoid a new split. Today, not of political space, but it will follow. But first of all, of information space. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate the moderator, your
It must be my tie. You like my tie. Professor, thank you for your comment. Can we take some other questions from the audience? Let's start with the gentleman here. Yeah, in the aisle. Near where the professor was, yeah.
My name is Louis Lasala. I'm actually representing the Vatican, the Holy See, the Apostolic Nunciature to Ireland here. And it's been a wonderful day today and certainly yesterday as well. But much of the discussion has been based on the protection of property rights or individual rights for access to information. But very little has been said about the protection of those most vulnerable in our societies. Children, people with intellectual disabilities, and even though I appreciate there are technical difficulties to protect such people, to protect citizens against child pornography and things like that, I was just wondering if anything can be done. Ambassador Leszczynski started the discussion very nicely, talking about the need for not only protecting freedom, but the accompanying responsibilities that come with that freedom. And I'm just wondering if governments and society at large have any responsibility to protect those most vulnerable in our society. Is there anything that can be done, or do we just give up?
Do you have a particular person you want to aim that at?
No, I'll throw it to the panel, any of the panelists who would like to comment on it.
Does anyone have Andrew, is that one for you?
Well, I would agree that there is a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable, and the abuse of children is a crime, and it should be, those responsible should be brought to justice. And we see in a number of countries, unfortunately, large numbers of people being caught and prosecuted. But hopefully, we need a more effective prosecution. We need to find ways to prosecute and bring to justice more people who are responsible for the abuse of children. I think the internet magnifies and makes more visible a problem which has been, unfortunately, long with us. And we need the law enforcement agencies in countries around the world to be cooperating together to bring those responsible to justice. And I think it's one of the first responsibilities of government to protect the most vulnerable. Fully agree with that.
Isn't this, in a sense, what Frank LaRue was saying yesterday, that although you could have certain measures that were technical engineering responses, really what the government also is supposed to do is to prosecute criminals. And so if someone's doing something wrong online or offline, the police should be knocking on their door, irrespective of what happens on the medium.
I mean, I think it comes back to what was said also in the panel yesterday about international human rights standards should apply whether it's on the internet or in the real world. And it's clear in terms of international human rights standards that the rights of children need to be protected, whether it's on the internet or in the real world.
And Yanis, you had...
I would just like to respond to the representative of the Holy See by referring to the very specific commitment adopted by the OSCE in 2007 in Madrid at the Ministerial Council, which called on participating states that have not yet done so to collect and store information in accordance with national provisions on the protection of personal data. You see, again, there is a balancing with the values, some values like protection of personal data, but to collect, taking into account that value, to collect the information on persons convicted of child sexual exploitation or abuse in order to facilitate the apprehension of perpetrators and monitoring of their probation, to develop, where appropriate, instruments to enable the exchange of information internationally among law enforcement agencies pertaining to sex offenders' convictions and disqualifications, and so on and so on. In addition, the OSCE states committed to criminalize possession of child pornography, and so on, because that possession, viewing and possession, stimulates production of that. So yes, vulnerable groups are very much on the mind of OSCE, and some concrete commitments have been adopted in that respect.
This is not my area, but just to say that obviously in the area of child pornography we're talking about police activities, and it's true. One of the areas where the police still are catching up is in the area of cybercrime, and of course it's not just stealing credit cards, this is also part of a cybercrime criminal activity, catching up in the sense of having qualified people, harmonising national legislation. The ambassador also referred to this freezing, exchanging data. One good evolution though is that the EU is now setting up in The Hague a cybercrime centre as part of Europol, which it will kick in September. And one of the things that it's going to do is sort out the jurisdiction issue, because in these areas the problem with the internet of course is that virtually all of the activities are cross-border, and therefore the police are often confused, do I have jurisdiction or does the guy next door have jurisdiction? So a lot of time is wasted either because police think that somebody else is doing it and responsible, or because there are too many duplicative efforts that are not really going anywhere. So one of the things that I think that apart from harmonising legislation in cyberspace when it comes to the definition of criminal activities and things like extradition and punishments, but one of the things that the Cybercrime Centre will do is that when anything like this comes to light, it will designate a lead police authority, France, UK, that is going to take the lead in conducting the investigation and to which others will work towards. So if you at least get a more organised international cross-border police response, I think it will help. But of course there's the question of anonymity, because one of the key things is breaking anonymity when it comes to criminals on the net. But of course anonymity is something which is very much treasured by lots of citizens, precisely because they can express themselves freely in this space without the risk of revealing themselves. So how we balance the issue of breaking anonymity in the case of criminals while still trying to uphold it for legitimate citizens who are simply wanting to express their views, whether we do it through encryption or other techniques, or this is, I think, going to be one of the big issues.
It's funny, reflecting on where these technologies came from, if you read any of the documents from Paul Baran, who probably more than anyone else was the mastermind behind the technologies that the internet uses, you see that early in his writings in the 60s, he's already telling his employers at the RAND Corporation, your alumni body, he's already telling his employers that this new technology is going to be a problem for censorship. You probably won't be able to censor on it. And a few years after that, he says, it's also going to be a problem for privacy. So there's a grain of the technology that raises these issues. Just to keep going in the right direction, the grain of the technology, if I could ask Robert, if you're ready, with maybe 2 questions from people watching on Twitter.
So one question here is, there was mention in the panel about the unintended consequences of surveillance legislation passed by democracies. There's mention about surveillance equipment that's built for kind of democracies and what happens when it goes to other parts of the world. However, what wasn't mentioned, and this is a question if the panel could address, is about the growth and the new industry of malware, some of it being state-sponsored malware, and what the panel wishes to comment on that. And the other question was kind of an OSCE question to hear from all the panelists, is given we're at an OSCE conference, what is it that the OSCE could do? Could it be involved in tracking and trying to do research on what the malware issues are? And there was a comment made that all these surveillance equipment and malware are the digital weapons of today, and given that OSCE has been involved in some arms control, what would be the role of the OSCE?
Now, could I ask Natalia, could you try and take both questions, and maybe we'll open it out after that. But I think you've probably been on the receiving end, perhaps, of some Western technologies. So if you have, it would be useful to hear that.
Well, I fully share the concern with respect to the exports by many foreign private companies of that intelligence equipment to authoritarian countries, because there's a lot of that kind of monitoring going on through computers and through mobile telephones in Azerbaijan and Belarus and in many other countries. And as I mentioned, in those criminal cases that were opened after the presidential election, many materials that had been eavesdropping materials, Skype communications, email communications, became part of the case materials. And so the scandal that erupted because TeliaSonera cooperated with Belarusian operators really did make a lot of sense. It did not appear for nothing, because all the mobile operators in Belarus know full well that some eavesdropping equipment has been installed. It is in operation, and they keep cooperating with the secret services. Let me just give you one example. After on the 19th of December in 2010, about 50,000 people came into the streets of Minsk. All the presidential candidates and many leaders of the opposition were arrested, and many people were summoned to the KGB and to the police precincts because operators had been feeding information to the government and telling the government who was where at that particular point in time. And so people were summoned, and they were asked, "What did you do in that in the central square of Minsk?" So she says, "You know, I was not there." And the police officer told him, "No, you're lying, because we have information from the mobile operators saying that you were in that square at that time." Many people were excluded. Many students were excluded from the university. Criminal cases were opened. There's a lot of intimidation going on because of information that had been imparted by the mobile operators. Therefore, I fully share the concern of those panelists who said that this is a major problem. It is a major problem indeed, because Western companies keep cooperating with authoritarian regimes, and we need to put an end to this. And some code of ethics must be put in place for those companies, because the ethics that they have for the time being just does not work, and a ban should be introduced on the exports of that kind of equipment to authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
And as a follow-up, Natalia, do you suggest that there should be a situation where private sector companies are telling states of any type what they should be doing? I mean, is that what you're suggesting? And if so, how would that work?
Well, I believe that governments must issue literally instructions to private sector companies. In other words, there must be some morals in politics and in business. What we see today is realpolitik in politics, where people overlook human rights abuses because of all sorts of geopolitical interests and considerations. And in business, making money, making a profit, making a fast buck is more important than human rights. So people overlook the kind of companies and the kind of countries that private business is cooperating with, working with. I think we need to put an end to this. I mean, Belarus is of no interest to anyone. It's not interesting to politicians. It's of no interest to anyone at all. I mean, people say that they are concerned with what's going on in Belarus, but this country has been having a dictatorship over the past 20 years, and nothing happens. I just want to thank the United States of America, because some economic sanctions were introduced against Lukashenko's regime. That was the first country who did the right moral thing. But unfortunately, the European Union is not joining those sanctions, and Belarus has a much broader range of cooperative endeavors with the EU than it has with the United States. So the trade, commerce has gone on. Very active economic relations are growing, and private business companies keep cooperating with Belarus. Many Western banks do brisk business in Belarus. I mean, these are all part and parcel of a larger picture.
Okay. Well, I guess then the question carries on to Jamie. Part of what you're doing in building confidence-building measures and areas for cooperation is part of what you're doing to include the private sector and to include NGOs? And do you run into a position where you're including organizations of one type or another in a state, which may or may not be a member state, and the government of that state would not want you to be working with them?
Well, this is a very good, very complicated question. The first thing about cyberspace is it's probably the first security problem in history which is going to require a very broad coalition to address and to solve. The private sector, governments, Western democracies are having at least a minimum understanding of the rules of the road with less democratic states, the private sector. We're going to have to sort of bring all the things together. And frankly, this is going to take, to my mind, several years before we come up with an acceptable arrangement. But that's not a reason not to start the process now. Now, obviously, when you talk about cooperation among states, I think it's clear that states that are democracies will have a closer cooperation among each other in the first instance. They'll be more willing to share intelligence. They'll be more willing to have their vulnerabilities assessed and tested. They'll be more willing to participate in things like exercises and the rest, or cooperative cyber crisis management things like freezing data, opening up to investigations, for example, asking their internet service providers, those things, to cooperate, harmonizing domestic legislation. So I think that this is a kind of ripple effect, that you start with the inner ripple and then you gradually move out. With states, frankly, where there isn't the same degree of trust, that doesn't mean to say there's nothing you can do. We spoke earlier about the confidence building measures, where you can begin with, for example, making your cyber policies transparent to each other. Many states in the world don't have a cyber policy at all, or if they do, they certainly don't make it public. So we have no idea, unlike, for example, the US, which has published a national cyber strategy, and the EU is promising us one for later on. NATO has a published cyber policy. So if we could have, for example, agreement, everybody could be transparent about their strategies, for instance, then we could have, for example, with like the US and China recently, tabletop exercises to look a little bit into how one sees cyber defense. We can use the dialogue with these other states to clear up the misunderstandings, because frankly, when it comes to NATO, there are enormous misunderstandings about what our posture is, and so we need those dialogues to sort of avert those misunderstandings.
You're talking about state to state.
Yeah.
And you started off by saying this is the first environment in which we need to include everybody,
Yes,
not just states.
Absolutely.
So for those people who aren't states, you know, how do you find working with the private sector, if that's going to be one of the major things? Is that on the agenda, and how's it working out?
Well, I think in terms of the private sector, they own most of cyberspace, they develop it, they're responsible for most of the protection, because even where states are protecting themselves, they're doing it via private security companies rather than employing their own civil servants to carry out that degree of protection. So that relationship, I think, is going to be critical. Now, the thing here, of course, is a question of liability and responsibility. If something happens, is it the fault of the company that should have produced better software? Is it the fault of the user that should have taken more caution in developing the software? What sort of rules can we put on private companies in terms of the standards that they should observe? Because it's right, private companies are out to make money from their products. Often security is the last thing that they think about when they develop products. Like cars, you know, they want faster cars, sexier cars. Cars that are more difficult to burgle are often at the bottom of the list. So that's where I think the essential dialogue is going to be. For example, as the technology advances, mobile phones or cloud computing now, which has a lot of commercial advantages, what can we ask private sector companies to do to make our data more secure? Now, let me here come up with a practical example. DigiNocta. Last year, the Netherlands revealed that one of its companies, called DigiNocta, had been compromised by an Iranian hacktivist. 300 certificates were compromised, and we don't know how much, but a lot of data obviously was in the hands of the Iranian government as a result of that. So when private sector companies are storing our data, what kind of, what is the liability that they should accept? Banks is an obvious case, but there's also the data belonging to activists in authoritarian regimes that they should observe. What are the minimum standards? For example, in the case of DigiNocta, they took 6 weeks before they informed the Netherlands government what had happened. And that after that date, it was impossible to freeze the data. The data had disappeared. You've got to freeze it immediately if you're going to collect it as evidence. So I do think we can have a dialogue with the private sector where states probably can intervene better than individuals or NGOs as to how much responsibility should they accept for the security quality of the products that they're commercializing.
Okay, and I think there was... the second question was about the OSCE and its role. And maybe part of that is, does the OSCE have a role to support dissidents within member states, or is that possible? Or how does that work?
OSCE certainly has a role, because OSCE has developed commitments that were agreed by all. They were not imposed by some on the others. They were agreed by all. And these commitments include the right to privacy. And it is perfectly clear that if some state agency opens a private email or mines into the mobile phone company data about where a certain individual was going, that is a violation of the right of privacy. And it's a very clear violation of an unequivocal commitment, one of the OSCE commitments, that says that the participating states reconfirm the right to the protection of private and family life, domicile, correspondence, and, listen to this, electronic communications. They said that in '91 already. Quite a visionary commitment. But it's there. Everybody has agreed with that, and everybody is bound. Now, what can OSCE do in order to see that these commitments are being implemented? In OSCE, we don't have the court like they have in Council of Europe, but you can complain if you feel your rights are being violated, and the court then adjudicates the matter. In OSCE, we have something else. We have, on one hand, institutions like ours that keep reminding participating states of the commitments that they themselves entered into and that they need to respect. And the other thing that we have the Permanent Council, where fellow participating states have the right, and indeed an obligation, I would add, to raise cases when commitments that have been jointly, commonly agreed and accepted are being violated. So that's the role of the OSCE, in order to ensure that this kind of commitments, and I quoted already several of them, very concrete commitments, are implemented.
Let's take some questions from the floor. Yes, you, sir.
Let me express my thanks to all panelists. And cyber security and cyberspace are one of the important issues, not just for any country which is a member of the OSCE, but also it's important in different measures, like in regional level, in global level. And you mentioned that our current treaty basis for cybersecurity, it's mainly 2001 Budapest Convention on cybercrime and on data protection, Convention 108 of the Council of Europe, also dated 1980s. And there are discussions that is it sufficient such a legal instruments which provide security or ensures cyber security, and what would be our panelists' position on this matter, because some countries initiate necessity of the creation of the new legal instrument under United Nations, or others think that this is not necessary because existing conventions gives a real possibility for cooperation. We, as Azerbaijan, joined to Cybercrime Convention in 2008, and our parliament ratified it in 2009, and since 1st July 2010 it became a part of our national legislative system. And I know that in Vilnius also a special task force on cybersecurity under the leadership of the United States has been created. What would be your attitude to what? Do you think that existing infrastructure on cooperation on cybersecurity is enough, because different entities, institutions like NATO, Representative Kandler reported us, or ITU's impact deals with this matter, Council of Europe or European Commissions, all different institutions deals with this matter. Do you think that it's enough, or we need to go forward, step forward, and to create totally new mechanism which reflects modern reality of the 2020s?
Okay, I think we have, thanks. So does anyone have, it may be that the entire panel says we're okay where we are and nothing else is needed, in which case we can move on. So is there anyone who thinks there is something additional needed to what we already have? I think people are happy with what they have, but thank you. Yes, this gentleman at the aisle with the blonde hair.
Thank you. Charles Lonsdale from the UK delegation. I just wanted to pick up on Andrew Anderson's comments at the beginning about the UK Communications Bill, but also on the discussion now that we've had, which brings out firstly the vital importance of protecting the real world freedoms and rights in the online world, but also the necessity of effective law enforcement in the online world. The UK bill is firstly obviously subject to very wide, very active public debate and debate in Parliament, but it's essentially about maintaining the existing law enforcement capabilities to use communications data. There are no plans to reduce the existing safeguards or to allow public bodies to access data on demand. You would only be able to access data on a case-by-case basis where it's necessary and proportionate. Nor are there plans to monitor the content of emails. I think this is a very important point. Access to content would only be possible on the basis of a warrant from the Secretary of State, in effect, an online search warrant. It's bringing the real world measures into the online world. What it is then, I think, is emphatically not, as might have been implied or might have been understood, about outsourcing full-time surveillance of everybody all the time. This is effectively about how do you arrange or how do you manage effective law enforcement. So in terms of a question, I suppose the issue is really, again, how do you protect and ensure rights and freedoms while also ensuring law enforcement to protect those very freedoms and rights?
Andrew, is there a particular way you'd like to have tweaked that legislation, or what you said about it, one or the other?
Well, I think one of the issues, of course, will be that fortunately in the UK we have an open discussion and debate about draft legislation, and hopefully it will be improved before it's adopted. But one of the features of the way this legislation was launched in the UK was that ministers briefed newspapers with lurid accounts of what it was going to do. The newspaper headlines were all about this was going to be Snooper's Charter, that it was going to be surveillance of every email, every SMS message, every Facebook posting. Now that came from government spokesperson briefing that that's what the legislation was going to be about. Maybe in the end there will be sufficient legal protection. I certainly hope so. And one of the healthy things about the UK is, of course, that we can have that criticism of the government policy and that debate around the government policy. But even before we get to the stage of what is the actual law that comes from this process, there has been a negative impact because of the way the government spoke about the initiative that it was launching. And that has had a negative impact, not just within OSCE, but around the world.
Jamie, you wanted to say...
I'd like, sorry, if I may, but to come in to the previous question from the gentleman from Azerbaijan, because I think it wouldn't be fair to give him the answer that we're fine where we are. Clearly we're not. I think one of the issues is the mechanics of cyber security. it's not just, extending the Budapest Convention, which many non-European countries have signed up to. I agree that's an excellent document. But we're in a situation where the response mechanism simply isn't sufficiently wired up. For example, some countries take the cybersecurity issue very seriously at the national level. UK is one. We were just talking about that, the US. But others don't, have almost in denial, waiting to be attacked. For example, the European Commission recently came out with a report that only 10 of its member states, less than half, had proper national cybersecurity policies. For example, very few have CERTs, computer incident response mechanisms. Those certs are not joined up. They don't exchange data, for instance. They don't correspond to the certain minimal standards. And of course, in a cyber world, you're only as strong as your weakest link. They don't have the same definitions of cybercrime. There are many countries where the judiciary is simply unable to understand, like with financial crime, the extreme complexity of dealing with cyber issues. And so we need more trained judges, more trained lawyers specializing in this area. I mentioned the problem of the police earlier on. We need more crisis management exercises so we have a common view of how we would cooperate in handling a cyber incident. In all of these areas, for example, using intelligence material in criminal investigations, sensitive area, we need to look at the mechanics. Do we really have a joined up sort of London Underground map where everything smoothly connects to everything else so that we're effectively able to transmit best practices, give early warning to each other, and at least have a minimum stand? Because as I said earlier, if you don't have confidence in the cyber area, if you're terrified of using it because you're worried about the compromises that could occur, the great potential of this will gradually disappear. It will be seen increasingly as a risk rather than as an opportunity. So, let's not just look at legislation, let's also look at the practical wiring diagram of cooperation as well, because at the moment you've got, 1/3 of the London Underground, and then you've suddenly got lines that don't connect to stations any longer.
Maybe we could take some more questions from Twitter, if you have a few lined up, Robert.
Let's see, there was a question that was directed to Mr. O'Shea in regards to the threshold that you would see that a cyber attack then leads to a response. So there was an issue in terms of cyberspace being another domain for different militaries. So in your view, there was a couple questions online, so that was a comment that was made online. And then another question that was being made online is if the judiciary that you just mentioned isn't capable of understanding the complexities, what do we need? Better judges? Do we need better educated parliamentarians? And I'll finish with another question, is a question that came up as well, is what's the role of the parliamentarians? That really hasn't come up. There are parliamentarians in different, the EU and in the US, Canada, and many other countries that are interested in this issue and they haven't been raised. And so what's their role in this discussion?
So before we got onto the what's the level that it needs a response, that warrants a response, let me ask Daniel that question about education of judges, and also the question about the role of parliaments. It might be something you have a view on.
Right. Look, on education of judges, I'm not sure how much to add other than the points already made, that some of these issues can be very complex technically, and so having specialized training for judges makes sense. On the role of parliamentarians, I think because I spoke earlier about mandates needed to control the export of technologies, that's clearly a role for parliaments. And there's a bill before the U.S. Congress, the Global Online Freedom Act, which seeks to curb these kind of technology exports. In the European Union, the European Parliament has passed a resolution trying similarly to limit some of the exports, but obviously in the EU case, it's really up to the Commission to decide whether they want to go ahead with it. And I don't know if it, within the EU context, whether it makes sense for member countries as well to look at national legislation. But I think certainly a role in trying to limit the export of surveillance and censorship technologies.
Okay. And on that question about when does a cyber incident become a cyber attack with a capital A? Do you have a definition?
No, and I think here it's probably a good idea not to have one, funnily enough. Ambiguity in security is often helpful. For example, if an organisation like NATO said, if you sort of destroy 5 of our banks, that's an Article 5 collective defence. But if you destroy 4.5 of our banks, it isn't. Then any attacker could know that he or she or it could sort of challenge a country up to a certain threshold, but knowing that as long as it didn't jump over the threshold, the state would not be able to respond. And I therefore think that this would be the wrong way to go. I think it's enough to say, as the US has done and many other countries have done, that a catastrophic cyber attack could have the equivalent impact of a kinetic attack, a physical type of attack in terms of disruption, damage, potentially destruction, as the cyber weapon moves increasingly from the virtual world into the real world, and that therefore the option of a proportionate response, which doesn't necessarily mean my electrons for your electrons, could be a different type of response, is open. Because I think that deterrence is a concept which should apply just as much to cyber attacks as to other attacks. So my sense is to make it clear that there could be those circumstances, but keep it open. That said, we also have to be practical about this. We cannot prevent cyber attacks as easily as we can prevent other types of attack. Anonymity, the asymmetry, the lack of geographical boundaries, the fact that a normal attacker can run out of steam very quickly, can run out of money, can run out of weapons. In the cyber world, you never run out of steam. You never run out of money. You never run out of weapons and technology. So the threshold at which you say, stop, I'm exhausted, isn't simply there. So for that reason, I think we can't have a cyber strategy based only on defense, as important that is, or even a response, if we can discover who it was that launched the attack in the first place. That could take a long time. It's very easy to respond the day after you're attacked against your aggressor. Not so easy if you only identify the perpetrator 3 years later, through forensic means. So I think we also have to go more to a concept of resilience, prevention, resilience, early warning, limit the damage, recovery as well.
Okay. That question about, separately, going back to the first question, that question about judges, it reminds me of a story from 2007 in Woolwich Crown Court, and the case of Arabi 007. This guy called himself Terrorist 007, and he was being prosecuted for having been instrumental in connecting people with different campaigns, different theaters for Islamist militant purposes. And on day 2 of the trial, the British judge paused the trial. He said, there's a technical problem. And the audience looked at him and they were wondering, was it a security issue? And he said, yes, there's a technical problem. I don't really know what a website is. So that's 2007. We're not that far away, but maybe significant strides have been taken. And Natalia, maybe you can tell us some more significant strides that should be taken.
If you're interested in the experience of Belarus judges, they are not only ignorant, but they are all for sale. You pay them enough and they find in your favor. I think in Belarus it's obvious that if a judge is dealing with a cyber case, he has to at least understand the definitions and the terminology and understand what's going on. Obviously, those judges need to be either specially chosen or retrained. But as far as cybercrime is concerned, I think what's important to understand is what Mr. Shea was saying about how clearly it's the same countries that are the source of cyber attacks, the same set of countries, and the governments of those countries are not doing anything to stop it, the Eastern European countries, to be more specific. I understand that often it's the government itself which is initiating those cyber attacks. If you look at Belarus, very clearly it's the secret services in Belarus when there are denial of service attacks on independent sites, or independent sites are infected with viruses or blocked to stop them organizing a protest on election day, and they're always using criminal methods to do all this. I would like to see more international reaction to this kind of thing. Charter97.org was set up in 1997, and there have been attacks on it every year, but we never hear any response from abroad. We hear the human rights activists responding, we hear Freedom House, we hear frontline defenders, but we never hear any governments abroad giving any response. And if we may, that brings us back to the OSCE. Belarus is a member of the OSCE, is a participating state, but throughout the years of its time in the OSCE, it has been continually undermining and violating the principles of the OSCE. All the elections that ODIHR has sent monitors to have all been falsified. There hasn't been any free democratic elections in Belarus ever. The idea of any OSCE representatives on freedom of expression coming to the country is just absolutely not allowed. Dunya has never been to Belarus, so they don't let people in from the OSCE. They continue to repress journalists. They continue to do all those things which are against all the principles of the OSCE, and yet they haven't been kicked out of the OSCE. There should be some mechanism where if the OSCE violates the principles of the OSCE, then Belarus should be out. Why, if there's no way of kicking a country out, what's the point of having those principles?
Is there anybody on the panel you'd like to respond to that question? Or will we move on? Okay.
Let me say something about the judges first, maybe the OSCE second. On judges, yes, it's extremely important that they are well trained and educated, but what is even more important is that they are independent, truly independent. So independent that it is not a problem for any judge, for instance, to throw out all the evidence gathered by government through mining private SMS messages or email without proper court order and so on. And on OSCE, yes, it is a sad fact that a number of participating states, well, a large number of participating states, or most participating states to different degrees, have not lived up to their commitments. And yes, there is a need to keep repeating the need for each one of them to fulfill the commitments that they themselves agreed to. There are mechanisms that are available, there are tools that are available, we try to contribute to this, but ultimately it is the responsibility of the government of each individual participating state to fulfill its commitments.
On that note, let's see at the very back.
Hi, I'm Smart McCarthy from the International Modern Media Institute. We've been seeing a very strong trend towards militarization of the internet over the last couple of years with such exploitative mechanisms such as Stuxnet and Flame recently and so on, not to mention the fact that, well, I can't even count how many times I spent, how much time I spent trying to counteract Saudi Arabian DDoS attacks on citizen media websites last year. So one question that comes to mind is, this militarization is effectively creating a market in zero-day bugs, that is to say, undisclosed vulnerabilities in software. And this market effectively incentivizes software developers to potentially create intentionally bugs and sell them to the highest bidder through some means, which reduces the overall security of everybody who uses that software, of course. So my question is, if we understand the fact that the internet is first and foremost a marketplace of information, and not to mention the fact that it's a multi-trillion-dollar economy, can we get some idea about to which degree this militarization will be allowed to continue, given the fact that there's very large losses that can occur from that kind of activity?
Is that directed at a particular person on the panel?
Not as such, but I would like to hear in particular Mr. Shea's opinion. But anybody, please.
Jamie?
Well, it's an extremely good question. The answer is that the internet is now so germane to our lives that every sector of society is increasingly dependent on it. Every sector. But that also, of course, does apply to the military. If you look at weapons systems, they are increasingly reliant upon chips, electronics. You even have now systems which don't have human beings at all any longer, such as drones or robots, nanotechnology, artificial technology, and all the rest. This is an electronic revolution that nobody is going to be able to stop. And that does have many implications for the military. It brings advantages, of course, in, for example, the electronics that we had in NATO surveillance over Libya allowed a degree of accuracy that has never been known in previous conflicts in terms of discriminating between civilians that you want to protect and legitimate military targets. You know, we now have precision weapons, which again vastly reduce the sort of damage that you would have experienced with the dumb bombs of World War II. So this is not necessarily a negative phenomenon if it does allow more discriminate, less costly operations where military force has to be used. But on the other hand, you're quite right, it brings about a tremendous dependency. For example, a US drone over Iraq a few years ago, the video was captured by an extremist group on the ground that used a device downloaded for $26 from the internet, and it cost a lot of money to patch that up. Lots of weapons systems now run on Windows. It has tremendous advantages. So I think again, this is not a simple answer. We have to recognize that there is therefore a large military interest, even all the more so as the dependence on computer systems vastly increases the risks of espionage or the compromise of important intelligence information. As I said, what are we going to do about it? Well, I think first of all, I think we're just going to have to recognize that all conflicts in the future will have a cyber dimension to them. We don't know how decisive or how big that dimension is going to be, but it's going to be there. We also have to recognize that the military have to do their best to protect themselves in that environment. For example, you're right, a large number, I think the Pentagon last year reported publicly 1,800 examples of compromised chips, microprocessors, from being sourced beyond the United States. So do we dare source more of the stuff at home? It may cost us more, but we therefore have more control over the quality, for example. Sorry, too long. Okay, got the message.
Now
just to give you some sort of examples. But let me just say one thing which is more fundamental. I do think, however, that we do need now a discussion like we had with nuclear weapons. You know, nuclear weapons come to an end. Nuclear weapons were invented in 1945. And it took many years to put in place the system of controlling those weapons so their harm potential was minimized. Arms control of talks, for example, elimination of whole classes of weapon. We're going to probably, have to go through the same dialogue in cyber weapons as we had with nuclear weapons to gradually bring these things under some kind of system of international control. Excuse me, I apologize.
Not at all. Daniel, you have about 20 seconds because then that means we can get some questions from people on Twitter before we leave.
Well, just very briefly, I think I'm very worried about the militarization of cyberspace, and I think particularly open societies and open economies are particularly vulnerable, and there are cases where it looks like some of the governments that are actually developing offensive capabilities in cyberspace are the ones who would at least, be most vulnerable, and if similar weapons were used against them. At the level of the individual users, I mean, if you're talking about brand name services, some are more security conscious or better at protecting privacy than others, and that's up to their consumers. And when groups like Freedom House are advising civil society activists, we can give advice on that. But there are also, some of the worst actors in the internet business are very small companies that no one's heard of, and precisely because of that, they don't worry about brand name recognition. And
And Robert, if you can give us maybe 2 questions from Twitter, and we'll address them in the last 2 or 3 minutes.
Let me just take a look. I'll just say that the last kind of round of questions and comments has generated a lot of activity kind of online and kind of comments. But in regards to, I guess, questions maybe going to an earlier point that was raised around confidence building measures, maybe could different panelists, particularly Mr. O'Shea, talk about and detail a bit more what specific confidence building measures, and how is it that NGOs, private sector, and others could all work together to actually really know, do we have a problem or not? Because a lot of the issues that we're hearing are anecdotal, and a lot more research perhaps is needed, and so maybe knowing...
and could you maybe give us a flavor, very, very briefly, each question, just a flavor of what
the question was here, what type of confidence building measures was one. The other one is, how do we create a dialogue between states? And one question that just came up right now is should we develop a cyberspace treaty along the lines of the Outer Space Treaty?
That's a very good one to finish on. Does anyone have a strong wish to say a final 30 seconds on that?
Well, I apologize for intervening again, but the question was put to me in 10 seconds to allow others, obviously give others the chance. There are a lot of ideas out there in confidence building measures. We don't yet have an official list. We actually need to boil the ideas down to a list which is workable initially, even if it's not going to be perfect. Ideas are: publish your doctrine, so that there's transparency about your concepts of cyber defense. Number 2, cooperate with investigations, help to freeze data. If you feel that your private citizens have carried out the attack, don't say, oh, it was my private citizens, there's nothing I could do about it. The state, nonetheless, has jurisdiction on its territory, and therefore has a duty to cooperate, even if it's sort of patriotic hackers, and transmit that data, allow in investigative teams, agree, for example, to certain key things, like electricity grids, air traffic control will not be the subject to cyber attacks. Those kind of things. All this is imperfect. We need to start somewhere. The trouble is, a cyber treaty will take years and years to negotiate, and in the meantime, cyberspace will probably move on so much that a treaty will be irrelevant once it's in place. And therefore, the confidence building measure type is more flexible and therefore more adaptable to changing circumstances.
Like piracy on the high seas, it might be a long time before we see an international treaty. Okay, folks, right now lunch is being served in the same place where you had lunch yesterday. We'll be back in this room at 2 for the next session.